Just as each of us are working to provide our children with a unique and individualized education, the reasons that we chose to homeschool is also unique and individualized. Welcome to This is Homeschooling. I'm your host, Blair Lee. In this episode, I'll share my personal story of how I came to be a homeschooler. This will give you some insight into the how and the why that someone who is passionately invested in their child's learning outcomes would choose this path for their children's education. I found out that I was pregnant while I was teaching at community college. I was teaching chemistry and human heredity, and at that time I was already thinking a lot about learning. The reason I was thinking about this is that my students were really struggling. I had students in my classes who wanted to be vets or nurses or doctors, because that's who takes chemistry and human heredity, and they were struggling. And I also have known a lot of people who wanted to be nurses, and they have told me that the reason they're not a nurse was the chemistry classes, and I didn't want that for my students. When you teach at community college, a lot of the people in your classes are single moms and they have 2 kids, and you just know if they can get a nursing degree, it will change their life and the lives of their children. And so I was very invested in their learning outcomes. And I realized that they didn't have the science background to make it easy to be successful in science. They didn't have the critical thinking skills that you would hope that people who had a high school education had. They weren't able to do the sort of formulaic writing that is needed in science for things like lab reports and essay questions. And so I was concerned already, and then I get pregnant with my child. And so as a part of all the dreams, and trust me, I was dreaming about my child's education. A, I'm pregnant, so I've got those hormones going. But B, I'm the academic type, and so I'm always going to be thinking about my child's education, because like a lot of academics, I see a person's education as one of the most definite pathways to get to do and be whatever you want in your life. And so I wanted that for my child. I also had those dreams of being a participant in their learning journey. Now, at the time, I didn't realize I would be homeschooling. When I was pregnant, I wasn't already thinking about homeschooling. I was thinking about their school journey and how I was going to be a part of that, and I was going to be on the PTA, and yeah, those were where my dreams were when I first started thinking about my child's education, when I realized I was pregnant. I wasn't the only person who was thinking about education and learning outcomes at the time. We were having a big national conversation in the United States that led to bipartisan passage of the No Child Left Behind Act, and it had a lot of support from the citizens in the United States. It was and so that all was factoring into this pregnancy brain of mine, and then I had my child. So while I was thinking of my child's education, I wasn't thinking in terms of homeschooling. I'm not even sure that I'd heard of homeschooling at that point. Now, I joined, when my son entered toddlerhood, I joined a large meetup group for parents, and I was living in San Diego County at the time, and I joined this meetup group that had like 30 plus toddlers. It was so fantastic. Watching these little kids get together and interact and do all the crazy things that little toddlers do is just a blast. I had 2 friends who I knew previously. We met and got together when our children were really little. And so we all joined this group together. Within the context of this group, there were a lot of parents who were talking about their children's education. And this was the first time that I'd heard of homeschooling. And with my 2 friends, we started talking both in the larger context, but to each other as well. Now, their kids were going to start school a year before my child. And so they were having these, I was a part of the conversation, but I wasn't thinking in terms of what I was going to do. And they both became interested in homeschooling. We were having this conversation because of a book called The Well-Trained Mind. The Well-Trained Mind was very lucky about when it published. It came out a couple years before the No Child Left Behind Act passed. Now, I should warn you, the Well-Trained Mind is not secular. And it doesn't take very long of using it to realize that. But at the time we were all talking about it, I think all of us probably bought a copy so that we could be a part of this conversation with over 30 parents, parent groups. And so the Well-Trained Mind lays out how to educate children using a classical model. And I have given a lot of thought about why this is so appealing. And it's one of those models that's very appealing to adults, not as appealing to kids as I was going to learn. It really is. Its structure leads to rigidity. And if anyone follows secular eclectic academic, this was really one of the reasons I think that the eclectic homeschooling became probably the cohort that has the most homeschoolers using as a method. Back to the classical model, however. So my two friends and several other people from this parenting group decided to give kindergarten a try and homeschool using the classical model during kindergarten. And I was a total cheerleader. I was a cheerleader when they were making the decision, telling, you've got this, you can do it, and while they were homeschooling. And I could see that it was really successful for these kids who were being homeschooled. But the more I thought about being brave and giving it a try, the more doubts I had about myself and my ability to put this together. So I chickened out and sent my son to a traditional school for kindergarten. As you can probably guess, kindergarten didn't really work that well, or I never would have homeschooled. So just a little more backstory. My son was an early reader. He started reading at 3. We have a family history of early readers. I read at 2.5. My dad read at 3. My grandfather read at 3. We don't know further back. And there are genetic strands like that will run through some family. I'll never forget when my son started reading. I'd been at Target and spent like one of those $1.99 books as you're going through checkout. And the book's name is Zigby the Zebra. No need to look it up. It is not. I only remember this book because of the fact that my son sounded a word out in it, and the word was tree. As I'm reading this book for the very first time to my son, he pointed to the word tree and said, tree. At 3, when my mother-in-law heard about that, she then bought my son Hooked on Phonics, and I never would have used Hooked on Phonics with my child, I'll be completely honest, because to my adult brain, and at the time I didn't really think in terms of education for my child separate from myself, so to my adult brain that was incredibly boring. To my child's 3, 4-year-old brain, it was the most fun thing he could think to do, and he asked to do it all the time. That meant that when my child started kindergarten, he was already reading, and he was reading in the at second grade level, somewhere, not at the beginning second grade level, but somewhere in the middle of second grade level. During No Child Left Behind, that would mean that my child was not behind. By this time, we had moved from San Diego to a small rural area up in the Eastern Sierra in California, Nevada, and there were 12 children, including my son, in the classroom. So there's one reader, and there are 12 children who didn't just not read. Not one of them didn't just not read. None of them realized that the alphabetical letters had a meaning and a sound associated with them. So this is where really an extreme situation where you have one child that is above grade level in one of the two metrics, reading and math, that were measured, and you have 11 children who were actually at below kindergarten level. It probably won't surprise you to learn that I volunteered to work in the classroom, and the teacher was really glad to have an experienced educator in the classroom. Yes, I taught at the college level, but I was able to follow her instructions and work with the kindergarten students. This teacher was absolutely fantastic. And when you have 11 children that are below grade level, you know, one of the problems with No Child Left Behind, they did not increase funding for aides in the classroom. And so teachers became very reliant on volunteer helpers in their classroom. And so I went in 2 to 3 days a week and helped out in the classroom. What I observed were 11 students who were getting intense work to bring them up to grade level, and one student, who happened to be mine, being encouraged to take his time coloring. Teacher often didn't want my son up on the carpet with the rest of the students because if she asked questions, he knew the answers, and the other students had become very reliant on in those situations, on letting my son answer all the questions. So my son, now this fed into a problem that really concerned me, in addition to my son not getting academic work that he needed to do in class. My son was just naturally one of these individuals who likes to really take his time when he does anything. And so I'm watching this 5-year-old being encouraged to take as long as you need, which is really not a trait that I wanted him to spend more time working on. Because I recognized that that's a problem. That was going to lead to problems. So there were 2 parent-teacher conferences scheduled during the year, and at the first parent-teacher conference, the teacher said to me, "So you don't have anything to worry about?" And I was honestly aghast. And I said to her, "Well, you do. My son doesn't even know what it means to be in school. He's being encouraged to take his time with these coloring projects. And what are you going to do about it?" Now, I've got to tell you, so if in any way this comes across as negative, his kindergarten teacher was an amazing teacher. She was gifted at teaching and cared passionately about the learning outcomes of every student, my child included. But during No Child Left Behind, funding was so tightly tied to learning outcomes for those students that were behind being raised. It was really a problem for the students like my son who were above grade level. His teacher gave some thought about what to do and then reached out to the first grade teacher and asked if someone could come in and read with my son. She asked for somebody who was reading at the second grade level to come in and read. The first grade teacher sent a child who was reading at the kindergarten level. My son was already reading at the second grade level, so my son did give some tutoring to that child to teach them how to read, which was kind of cool. However, it really didn't address my concerns. The other concern I had was that there was a lot of testing going on of these kids and a lot of time spent teaching to the test. This was the one area that I could be guaranteed that my son was brought in. That's because because of the way funding was tied to testing, they wanted these high achievers to be tested, and they wanted to see growth in their test scores. And one of the easiest ways to see growth is actually to teach students how to be better test takers. Well, I wasn't happy about that, as you can imagine. And so this has led to the second parent-teacher conference. At the second parent-teacher conference, the teacher was already aware of my concerns. We had become very good friends at this point, so we talked about all of these things a lot. the teacher, she was concerned about a lot of the same things I was, not just for my son, but for our educational system. And some of the things the No Child Left Behind Act hadn't addressed, and some things that they'd introduced that were problematic. And she said to me, "Didn't you retire when you had your child?" And I said, no, I didn't retire. I went on sabbatical and just haven't gone back. And she said, "Well, have you ever given any thought to homeschooling?" And I said, "Well, just kind of a little at one point." And I told her, shared my concerns about my ability to succeed. And she said, "Well, I looked at where your child has made real progress. And what I realized is the 2 times you pulled your child out to go on vacation were the 2 times that they made the most progress in reading, jumping a couple of reading levels both times. And other than that, your child's progress in reading has been fairly stagnant." And that's something that we see with these kids because they're not getting a lot of teaching to improve their learning outcomes. So one of the weaknesses with the No Child Left Behind Act is, as I mentioned, there's no funding. And with no funding for other people to come in, there weren't people to help with this. They called it the top 10%. It really was a lot closer to the top 40% of students who were being underserved during the No Child Left Behind. And so I gave it a lot of thought, as you can imagine, and a lot of continued conversation with this teacher. She told me, "Hey, if you decide to homeschool, you can always reach out to me. I am always here for you with any advice and input that you need." And it was that gave me the confidence, and that is when I took the leap and started homeschooling my son for 1st grade. In case you're wondering, I did not nail it the first year, not even close. I did some things great, but there were other things that it was going to take more experience and more confidence for me to nail. We gave the classical model a try, and I stuck with it probably a little too long that year. It didn't work with my son. My son needed it to be much more eclectic and free-flowing. I really had a lot to learn about how people learn. I thought I understood it as a college professor, but I was going to take some deep dives into cognitive science for me to better understand how people learn and then be able to apply that within the context of my son's learning. If I could tell myself one thing, go back and tell myself one thing, I'm going to pass that along to you. And it would be, I guess it's 2 things. Relax and enjoy the ride, and just show up every day and do your best. Believe in yourself and believe in the process. That's it. I hope you enjoyed hearing this first part of my journey. There will be more personal stories, and I'll go into a deep dive into different aspects and things I came to realize as I was homeschooling.